Hi, everyone. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Dmitri Vitalyevich Trenin, who I think actually, like most of the people that Professor Vasilyeva and Jarlath have brought to us, needs no introduction. And I think, that any scholar at the most distinguished Russia-related think tank, the Carnegie Moscow Center, can reasonably claim to be a celebrity within the Russia expert community. And Dr. Trenin, a fellow there since its founding in 1993 and its director since 2008, is about as A-list as they come. And I think can take a lot of the credit for the status of that institution. A former intelligence officer in the Soviet and Russian army, he has held senior fellowships at the Institute of Europe in Moscow, at the NATO Defense College in Rome, and was also a staff member of the delegation to US-Soviet nuclear arms negotiations from 1985 to 1991. This impressive resume aside, his most recent book, Novy Balance Seal, I think speaks for itself and leaves us with no doubt as to his well-deserved status as one of the preeminent voices on contemporary Russia. Thank you very much, Dr. Trenin, for being here.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for this introduction. It's very generous. Not sure it's fully deserved, but it's nice to hear these words. I'm really privileged and proud to be part of this symposium, and I think that this is it has become an institution that is truly unique in this world. An institution that is powered by the intellect and energy of its founder, Professor Anna Vassilieva, and to be selected by her and included in the illustrious list of presenters at this symposium is as high an award as you can imagine. So, Anna, thank you so much for keeping me on your list. I hope I won't disappoint you too much today. Sean, I thank you especially for highlighting my book. It's this one. It's in Russian, and there's a purpose why it's in Russian. I think we need a very serious discussion within the country of the foreign policy record of Russia in the last 3-4 decades, a period of tremendous change also on the foreign policy front, and also an issue of contention in Russia's relations with much of the outside world. So the idea of having 2 lectures in succession, one today and the other tomorrow, is to, first of all, look at the record of Russian foreign policy since the days of Mikhail Gorbachev to this very day, to Vladimir Putin in late June 2021. Look at the successes, achievements of each reign. I would still regard Russia's leaders, whatever their title is, as de facto monarchs in the country. As the first article of the German Weimar Constitution stated, Das Deutsche Reich ist eine Republik, which is interesting. The German Empire is a republic, right? So I would say the Russian Federation is a monarchy. That should be the first article of the Russian Constitution. It may not be on the books, but nevertheless, it's very much the reality, and something that whether you accept it or not, you have to deal with. The second lecture will be on what to make of it, what to make of the achievements, what to make of the failures, what to make of the mistakes and blunders that Russia, under the leadership of its 3 eminent personalities, Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, and Vladimir Putin, has scored in the last 3-4 decades. And that to me is, it's actually the first time I'm discussing the findings of my book in a non-Russian audience. I've done that with some of my Russian friends. I've done that with the Russian public in interviews, in audio discussions, but it's the first time I'm doing that with an international, with a select international group. So I'll be very, very appreciative of the comments and criticisms that you would care to make. So let me start with the first lecture on Russia's foreign policy record, from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin. Since I look forward to having an interactive discussion with you, I will try to keep my initial remarks to a minimum. Let's say maybe 30 minutes, maybe somewhat more than that. But I really look forward to having your questions, your criticisms, and your suggestions. Anyway, the book is there, and I understand you all received copies of the book that were sent by Professor Vasilieva, and you can revisit those issues that I'm going to highlight in this talk today. My opening point on Gorbachev would be that although the man who has just turned 90 this last spring, although he is very much criticized and even reviled by a large portion of Russian society, and is also looked down upon as a very unsuccessful leader by much of the elite, Russia's foreign policy continues to stand, as we say, on the shoulders of Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign policy. That was the big change. The big change did not come with Yeltsin, did not come with Putin, although both Putin and Yeltsin introduced their changes, very important, very substantial. But the fundamental change from Soviet to post-Soviet happened on the on the watch of Mikhail Gorbachev, initiated by Gorbachev. So that's my first point, something that a lot of people would probably not want to admit to this day. As to Gorbachev's failure, again, let me be upfront, let me be very clear about that. The most serious mistake any Russian leader can make, I would even call it a political crime, is losing control of the country. And you may be a good person, you may be well-meaning, you may have bright ideas, but if you happen to be overwhelmed by the developments, if you lose control, if the country is essentially abandoned by its leadership and is moving on its own dynamic, that leads to chaos and catastrophe. That was the fate of Nicholas II, in many ways an exemplary family man. And that was the fate of Mikhail Gorbachev. Again, this did not happen because Gorbachev wanted it to happen, clearly not. But he lost control. And that is something that we always have to keep in mind and discuss it when we talk about his legacy. I would also add as a corollary to that the Soviet Union in the 1980s was facing its most serious general crisis in its entire history of 70 years, almost 70 years. But in my view, that was not necessarily, at least, a terminal crisis. So I'm not a fan of counterfactual history. I'm not a fan of discussing what if, but my own analysis of the Soviet situation in 1985 does not lead me to conclude that the Soviet Union was doomed when Gorbachev took over in 1985. Whether it's a good thing that the Soviet Union is no more a bad thing, that's beside the point. That's another thing. That it's not about foreign policy per se, but I think it's important to put that in a broader perspective. My next point is that Gorbachev's intense interest in foreign policy was not the product of his ideology, which was only forming or being deformed at that time or reformed, whatever. Was not a result of his personal ambition as someone who wanted to be a great leader and change everything or change bad things to good things. But that was dictated, first of all, by the dire state of the Soviet Union internally. And in many ways, his rapprochement with the United States, his arms control initiatives, his first treaties with President Reagan, including the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. All these things were dictated by Gorbachev's conclusion, very correct conclusion, that the burden of the arms race was undermining the foundation of the Soviet economy and would have enormous consequences for social and political atmosphere in the Soviet Union if you allow it simply to continue. So those were the preliminary remarks on Gorbachev. I see many achievements in Gorbachev's foreign policy, and top among them is the ending of the Cold War with the West, the dramatic reduction of the danger of a nuclear war. Today, most people look at nuclear as something that is there, but does not really matter all that much. They believe that it's securely under control, and people are not terribly bothered about potential incidents or potential friction among the nuclear powers. Not so in the 1980s. 1983 was perhaps just preceding Gorbachev's ascendance to the throne in the Kremlin, was perhaps the most dangerous year of the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was the time when then Party General Secretary and Soviet top leader Yuri Andropov, actually Gorbachev's mentor, was instructing Soviet intelligence officers around the world to look for any signs that the West was about to launch a decapitating nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. They even went as far as to, count the number of windows where lights were on at night at the Pentagon and some other government buildings in Washington, D.C. So we were really on the brink of something truly catastrophic. And had there been, had they detected a sign which would have been interpreted as a preparation for a nuclear attack, then a preemptive strike might have been launched, and we would not be sitting here and talking among ourselves today. My next point among Gorbachev's achievements is very different. I think intellectually, he broke through the dogma of Stalinist foreign policy that was well and alive and well, even under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, basically. This idea of us versus them, this idea of the world being divided into this Manichaean, if you like, view of the world as being divided between us, the Reds, communists, socialists, good people, progressives around the world, and them, capitalists, imperialists, what have you. Gorbachev's conclusion, which he voiced at the first party congress that he presided over in 1986, was that the world was one, that the world was essentially an integrated community of humanity. And from that flowed his vision of what came to be known as new thinking. New thinking was essentially openness, freedom of the dogma, debunking of ideology, and that, I think, is a great achievement of Gorbachev. He was not the principal thinker among those people, but he was the one who translated that thinking, primarily generated by the people whom he listened to among his advisors and intellectuals close to the leadership. He translated that into realities of Soviet foreign policy. I think he also was right in and courageous in essentially dismantling the system that had ceased to be a bonus for Soviet foreign policy, from Eastern Europe to the world communist movement. And my own view of Eastern Europe is that it was not in the interest, really, of the Soviet Union to keep that system beyond the very few years following the Second World War. It did not provide security to the Soviet Union with the arrival of nuclear bombs, with the arrival of strategic aviation, and then with the arrival of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So the Soviet Union did not really need that kind of a buffer on its borders, but increasingly having imposed its rule on largely unwilling subjects immediately to the west of its borders, the Soviet Union made a big blunder, and it guaranteed that these people will turn anti-Soviet, and later on they turned anti-Russian in their foreign policy. Nothing goes in that world. Nothing goes completely forgotten. So you have to deal with that legacy, and you didn't need it. You didn't really need that buffer, but it came to haunt you. Similarly, the world communist movement, which I think lost its steam, its real potential that Lenin and Trotsky had hoped for, even in the 1920s, and attempts to keep that alive. They may have succeeded in a few places like Italy and France to a degree in the 1940s, but they never really realized, and never came to be a reality. Perhaps the most lasting achievement of Gorbachev's foreign policy was the normalization of relations with China. And even to this day, just yesterday, President Putin and the Chairman Xi Jinping, in a video conference, decided to prolong the 20-year-old Russian-Chinese friendship and cooperation treaty. And this is the biggest achievement of Gorbachev's foreign policy that has survived to this day. We need to remember that the Soviet Union waged not one, but two Cold Wars. And the second one was against China. And in many ways, that was a Cold War fought closer to home, and with a tremendous expenditure on the Russian side, and some blood spilled, actually, in border incidents between the Soviet Union and China in the 1960s and the early 1970s. And Gorbachev's willingness to travel to Beijing, to sit down with Deng Xiaoping, to bury the hatchet and look ahead to a different future of the relationship is still with us. And I think this is very important. And I can go on, but let me move on. The withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think even Brezhnev understood very early that the dispatch of forces to Afghanistan put the Soviet Union into a trap, and he wanted to extricate the country from the trap. And it fell to Gorbachev to do the job, and he did the job. So much for the principal achievements. The failures of Gorbachev's foreign policy, I think primarily it was the defeat in the Cold War, not so much the end. There's a difference between ending the Cold War on acceptable terms and being defeated in the Cold War. And I think that the defeat in the Cold War happened within the country, and not so much on the outside contour, if you like, but within the country. The Soviet Union and the defeat of the Cold War was the defeat in the Cold War was essentially the defeat of the Soviet Union. Those are that's where I see the connection. Not the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was fine. Not so much the defection of Eastern Europe, which again I do not believe was a major problem. I don't think it was a problem at all. But the self-destruction of the Soviet Union led to the image of the Soviet Union being defeated in the Cold War, and that had enormous consequences. So this is not a foreign policy failure, but I think it was a larger policy failure. And I think that something that people lay at Gorbachev's door, and most recently President Putin, that Gorbachev allowed for NATO's enlargement or did not insist on NATO taking a legal commitment not to enlarge its membership to the east. To me, this is an issue which is overrated in real terms. In my view, NATO's membership Eastern Europe's membership in NATO is as much of a, how shall I put it, fake threat as the Soviet control of Eastern Europe was a fake threat, or a fake sense of security, if you like. So for the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe was a buffer, but that was a fake buffer in many ways. Now it's not a buffer; it's the staging ground, as some people would say, for Western attack against the Russian Federation. But to me, it's also a fake image, because if push comes to shove, it is not Eastern Europe, God forbid, but it's not Eastern Europe that will play the principal role in that. We have a very different military technology these days, and I know where the roots of that are, and that's another anniversary that we just marked. Actually, a week ago today, the 80th anniversary of the surprise attack by Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. Surprise, massive, and devastating attack. And I think it's etched in the Russian strategic collective strategic mind, so much more than Pearl Harbor is in the American strategic mind. That's the ultimate existential threat, really existential. And we were very close to being exterminated, in my view. So what are the lessons of Gorbachev? Again, I will not spend much time on that, but but there's some lessons to be learned. These lessons, in my view, are important for constructing the future, for our second conversation tomorrow. My first lesson is that military power is not enough for keeping the country alive. The Soviet Union died when its military was at the peak of its power, all-time peak. So the sound economy and the stable political system are the ingredients of longevity. Of course, married to sufficient military power. My second lesson is that financial dependency can be corrosive and could deform foreign policy. Gorbachev's foreign policy changed abruptly toward being so much more conciliatory somewhere in 1987, at the time when the Soviet Union found itself in a financial quandary. And Gorbachev's reforms being unsuccessful at home, and pressure on Gorbachev rising domestically, he had to actually chase the money. And that led to deformation of Soviet foreign policy and to concessions that Gorbachev had to make. I think that any Russian leader needs to learn from Gorbachev to hold foreign policy and domestic policy in some sort of balance. Domestic always weighs far more on the scales of equilibrium. Another thing that's more about Gorbachev and Yeltsin, duality of power is fatal for the Russian state. We saw that in 1917. We saw that in 1991 again. There cannot be two presidents in the Kremlin. People came to that conclusion when Boris Yeltsin in June 30 years ago, 12 June 1991, was elected president of the Russian Soviet Republic within the Soviet Union. And his residence was also in the Kremlin. And there cannot be two czars in the Kremlin at any one time. That's fatal. Idealism in foreign policy is tricky. It's much safer to be a realist. Gorbachev was an ultimate realist in domestic politics. He was an excellent manipulator of the party nomenclatura, and he could outwit a lot of people. He lost in the end, but he was a master of the game. In foreign policy, he unfortunately he let himself to be, I wouldn't say to be taken in, but he was more idealistic than he should have been. I think that reasonable sufficiency in the military sphere, military industrial sphere, is rather than parity, which is something that from Brezhnev on, the Soviet Union tried to achieve at a huge cost to itself. So military sufficiency is the golden rule. You never try to achieve parity with a country that is so much bigger than you, so much more resources it can rely on. Reliance on military means only can take you so far, and you have to be able to use political means. I think this is an economic, financial, and other means. I think this is important. I think this is very much adopted by Russia's foreign policy. Universal values are less than universal. I think that's something that we need to consider. Universal interests are even more ambivalent. At some point, I think Gorbachev was too much of an adept of his own new thinking, and those abstractions like universal values sent him on a course that was not very safe. A healthy dose of cynicism is indispensable in foreign policy. And I think Gorbachev was less cynical than he should have been. I lived for those days, and it's easy to talk about these things today. Then I think there was a feeling that somehow we were ending a huge misunderstanding between us and the Western world that was brought about by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And we need to be, they're members of our family, we're coming back to the family, and there was a lot of good feeling, I think, on both sides. But cynicism, I think, is a safer attitude to take in international relations. Cynicism doesn't mean you have to be negative, doesn't mean you have to be scheming, it doesn't mean, but you have to be, cynicism is realism that you're not shy to show, let's put it that way. I think there was too much focus on relations with the United States, which is understandable. Gorbachev was trying to end the Cold War, but not enough emphasis on relations with allies and neighbors. And I think this is something that we still carry on with us today. Gorbachev, for example, was, as Brezhnev in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, Gorbachev was surprised by some of the developments in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. The Soviet leadership understood Afghanistan, did not at all understand Afghanistan. I understood it quite badly, what was happening out there. Trust between countries governments can only exist in the form of predictability. You do not trust countries the way you trust people. But predictability is achievable, and that is a valid objective. Objectives actually require strategy. Gorbachev had some objectives where what he did not have was a well thought through strategy of achieving those things, and that is. So let me stop here with regard to Gorbachev and move on to Yeltsin. I'll spend a bit less time on Yeltsin, I think, as on Gorbachev, and I hope to be done within maybe 10 minutes. Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Putin. One thing about Yeltsin, the Yeltsin period to start with, is that the Russian Federation is the same country. Let me put it this way. The Soviet Union was another name for Russia, just like the Russian Federation. We should not pretend that somehow the Russian Federation is a new country. It may not be. It may be a new form of the Russian state, as the Soviet Union was a new form of the Russian state, as the Russian Empire was a new form when it was proclaimed of the Russian state. In the book I've referred to, I talk about various forms of the Russian state. I think 5 principal forms of the Russian state in history. Yeltsin's foreign policy was very much the continuation of Gorbachev's policy, although in many ways Yeltsin sought to differentiate himself from Gorbachev. He was more radical than Gorbachev, where Gorbachev was looking for convergence with the West, a highly idealistic and non-realist objective. Yeltsin opted for joining the West. And he committed a different kind of mistake when he thought that this joining was a possibility. I'll talk about it in a moment. With Yeltsin, national interest disappeared for a period of time in the wake of the doubling of the communist system and the embracing and Russia embracing democracy and capitalism. It seemed that for a period of time that national interests were superseded by broader interests, and that was certainly not the case. The fallacy of that became apparent a couple of years later. Yeltsin committed a major sin, in my view, by Yeltsin and his people, by turning to the West for support. He turned to the West for support against Gorbachev, and then against the Supreme Soviet, the rivals to his power inside the country, and he turned to foreign advisors and foreign specialists in the 1996 presidential election, and that I think is a sin, certainly not to be repeated. I think there were unrealistic expectations with Yeltsin about Russia's status in the expanding West. I talked about Russia joining the West, but Yeltsin wanted Russia to join on honorable terms as some sort of a vice president to the United States and this expanded West, which was certainly a fantasy and not supported by any realistic assessment. And Yeltsin's foreign policy had, like Gorbachev's, it had two periods, very different periods. I would say the Kozyrev period versus the period of Primakov. However, what are the achievements of Yeltsin? I think the achievements were that the principal achievement was that the Soviet Union went down without a civil war. Civil war within Russia, or civil war, almost civil war between Russia and the other republics. And this is not something that you would take for granted. Yugoslavia, a country which was closer to Western civilization, if you like, than the Soviet Union was, plunged into a decade of murderous wars. The Soviet Union, by and large, escaped out of the former Soviet Union. Yeltsin managed to consolidate all Soviet nuclear weapons, which was a major task, avoiding a civil war with nuclear overtones. He managed to, when I say he, it doesn't mean Yeltsin personally, but the Russian leadership under Yeltsin. They managed to a degree to integrate the Russian Federation into a global world, from North Atlantic Cooperation Council, Partnership for Peace, to the Council of Europe, to the G8 and World Bank and the IMF, many other institutions. The status of the Soviet Union as a great power and permanent member of the UN Security Council was formally confirmed in Yeltsin's times. Yeltsin managed to conduct a policy leading to calm relations with Eastern Europe. It was a brief period when Russian Eastern European relations were fairly calm, fairly non-contentious. He managed to combine Western integration of Russia, or attempted Western integration of Russia, with developing partnership with China. Very interesting, very interesting. He continued Gorbachev's legacy, communist China, all that, but that was continued, very realistic. He reached out to a number of non-Western countries and managed to have good relations with those non-Western countries, such as Israel, Gulf countries, Gulf states, South Korea, and several others. He managed to put an end to conflicts, not so much to put an end, but to freeze the conflicts in the former Soviet Union, from Tajikistan to the South Caucasus to Moldova. The conflicts were not resolved, but at least blood stopped flowing. And he eventually, under Primakov, managed to find some sort of a golden middle between openness and protection of the national interest. And that was an interesting point of equilibrium that might have lasted, but it did not. The failures, integration into the West, I already referred to the unrealistic expectations. Stopping NATO's eastward expansion, I don't think it was such a big issue as people decided it was. Managing relations with Ukraine, I think that this ignoring the largest republic of the former Soviet Union was only to the detriment of Russia's interest. And ignoring Ukraine, thinking of Ukraine as simply transit territory for Russian gas and oil was a huge, huge mistake. Protecting Russian ethnic Russians' interests in the former Soviet Union. Those were the failures, the lessons that can be drawn from Yeltsin's time. I think that the principal lesson was that Russia can only rely on itself. I don't mean only the army and the navy, but essentially it's a country that, since it cannot accept a leader over it, it has to learn to rely on itself. Foreign policy can and should be squarely based on the national interest. The problem is, of course, how to define the national interest, but that's another issue. Even close political relations do not abolish competition. Again, this is something that Russians learned the hard way. Ideology is a negative factor in foreign policy, usually. International relations are always about specific things, and Russian grand bargaining ideas were often a self-delusion. Policy toward the United States must be very careful when dealing with promises by incumbent American administrations. Successors can renounce those promises. I think the NATO thing is evidence piece number one. Domestic political considerations take precedence over more abstract strategic interests. You have to guard against that. Europe is not a sort of soft West compared to the United States, but a collection of states and a group of states, a union of states with its own interests vis-a-vis Russia, and should not be taken lightly. Let me end by saying that China showed a successful alternative to Russia's foreign policy. In many ways, what Russia could have done in the wake of the dismantlement of the Soviet Union was actually done by China, avoiding head-on collisions, focusing on oneself, building domestic base, and managing relations with neighbors, playing good neighbor. That is something that was not done by Russia. So let me discuss very briefly the Putin period. I will only talk about the lessons that I see in Putin's period. The status regained by Russia as a great power, essentially meaning that Russia is an independent international entity. That's how I would describe this great power status of Russia today. This status needs to be confirmed by economic and technological advances. Otherwise, it will be devalued. It is being devalued. Russia has reached an equilibrium right now in northern Eurasia. That's where it is, independent and largely self-sufficient power. But it needs to put its policy toward the east and the west and north and the south in some kind of an equilibrium. It's something that will take some time doing. The eastern vector of Russian foreign policy has become more pronounced, but it needs to be further energized and balanced within itself. There's a bit too much reliance on the Chinese relationship, while of course the eastern vector covers many more countries. And I would say, with regard to Ukraine and the former Soviet countries, gathering people should be the goal of Russia's foreign policy rather than gathering lands. Gathering lands of the former Soviet Union is a policy that is bound to fail and is also bound to bring a lot of bad things to Russia. And let me say that of all the mistakes of the Putin period in Russian foreign policy, none is bigger than Ukraine. And the the issue is not just NATO, which, as I said, was overrated. And in a way, Russia's attempts to protect against the consequences of NATO's enlargement made those consequences come to the surface faster, and in a more, let's say, radical modus. I think there was a profound misunderstanding of the Ukrainian elite's attitudes. There was a profound misunderstanding that for Ukrainian elites, the most important goal was implementing the Ukrainian political project, but that Ukrainian political project was absolutely inimical to any form of integration with Russia, even cultural, not to speak of economic, and of course not political. And this is something that people misunderstood. And yet I think that the results of Russia's policies toward Ukraine today are still better compared to the possible situation had Putin's plans in Ukraine been successful. Suppose Yanukovych had signed on the dotted line. Suppose that he had cracked down on the Maidan protesters. We would have a government in Ukraine that would not be accepted by the international community, far worse than Lukashenko is not accepted today. We would still have war in Ukraine, not in the east, not in Lugansk, but in the west, say in Lviv. The West would be certainly sympathetic to that rebellion, and of course, there are deep-seated roots of that rebellion in the west of Ukraine, as well as in the east of Ukraine. Russia would be spending far more on the 40 million strong population of Ukraine to keep it even minimally happy than it's spending on Donbass, and of course Crimea would be Ukrainian. So that is the price, actually the benefit of having failed in one of the central things. But in more general terms, and without any irony, I would say that Ukraine was the biggest and absolutely catastrophic mistake, Russia's policy toward Ukraine. I'm not suggesting that Russia could have kept Ukraine in its fold, just the opposite. But the idea of bringing together the former states of the Russian Federation, of the Soviet Union, into some form of a union, Eurasian Union, that Putin envisaged 10 years ago, was not only a non-starter, but it led to huge failures. A much better policy would be to focus on the Russian Federation and draw the people in, and draw the talents that were actually available and are still available in the countries that are turning more and more nationalistic and less hospitable to its Russian population. So let me stop here and turn the floor over to you, Sean.